Okay, gang. So here we are. So this is Cowl 126. This is the trajectory of justice. We teach this course each spring quarter, and we address the most current issues of justice that are facing our country and the world each spring. We have an abundance of riches this spring, having to do with justice, of course. But today we have students from the Rachel Carson College, and specifically the engineering, sustainable engineering students. Interestingly, with Rachel Carson being one of the major players in the environmental movement in the United States, often referred to as the mother of the environmental movement. She was largely responsible for generating the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States. In Adlai Stevenson, after whom this college is named, as many of you don't, he probably sounds like Ulysses S. Grant or somebody to you guys in your generation, but Adlai Stevenson was the fellow in the Democratic Party that if he had been elected in 1952, when he ran against Dwight D. Eisenhower, we would have spared the country Richard Nixon and the entire ordeal that we went through, which would have included probably eliminating the political assassination teams that were set up by Richard Nixon when he, as vice president, brought in Allen Dulles to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and set up the political assassination program, et cetera. So it's appropriate that we're here in the Adlai Stevenson College talking with people from the Rachel Carson College. And in the Cowl College, which is the Cowl Natural Forests around here are named after Henry Cowell. So that the environmental focus of the course this year is due to the fact that one of the major elements of the trajectory of justice this spring is having to address the issue of global climate change because of the half dozen major news stories that we're addressing that relate to justice this spring. Probably the principal one is global climate change. That there has been a huge pouring forth of additional information from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There's been a major study done by over a dozen of the major agencies of the United States government that have now joined in the chorus of telling people that it's dramatically worse than anybody thought. That it is accelerating at a rate that was unanticipated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change when they made their initial findings. They're discovering that the ice caps are melting much faster than had been anticipated. They're now projecting that there's a high degree of possibility that the entire Antarctic shelf may slide into the sea, generating over 200 feet increase in the global mean sea levels, which would mean that everything is going to be underwater here in this town, and all of Florida, and probably all 400 of the major private nuclear power stations that are within a mile of the seacoasts throughout the world. So this is a major concern of the course that we have here, and is also, as I said, one of the major headline issues of our day. The second one, of course, and the reason that this is in the news is because the leaders of the planet, the governmental leaders, are so transparently slow-walking, doing anything effective about this. And the reason for that is transparently the fact that the major oil corporations, coal and natural gas corporations, are basically paying for their campaigns and are engaged in a conscious program of deception. We now know, and it's established now, that they've known since the 1970s that their burning of petroleum, the sale of their products, and the promotion of their products is in fact generating massive climate change, and that it's going to be having, and is now presently having, disastrous consequences. The headlines of today are that there's been over 100 tornadoes in the last 48 hours in the states of Illinois and Oklahoma and Missouri, and they expect it to be going on all weekend long at this same rate. There are torrential downpours of rain in those areas. The rivers are overflowing. The Missouri River has overflown. It's flooding 85% of all of the counties in the state of Nebraska. The Pine Ridge Reservation, our staff from the Romero Institute is leaving today to drive back up to Pine Ridge to try to negotiate getting the Federal Emergency Management Agency to provide disaster relief for the reservation. The Trump administration's Federal Emergency Management Agency has maintained that they don't do reservations. They do states, so they don't know how to cope with a reservation. And they're saying they're only going to give the money to the state of South Dakota, which has its own discretion as to whether to give any of it to the tribe. So that the issue of global climate change and its direct, immediate consequences are right at the very top of the headlines today, competing, of course, with the impeachment of Donald Trump, which is constantly in the news every single day, and leading the news usually until the tornadoes reach over 100 in a given 24-hour period, and then that ascends to the leader of the headlines. But this impeachment, as we know, is generating a third major story, which has to do with this war going on inside the Democratic Party between the new, more moderate Democratic Party that has arisen at the end of the Cold War, led originally by Richard Gebhardt and Bill Clinton and the people that are part of the Democratic Leadership Conference that has actually been trying to lead the Democratic Party to the right, suggesting that they were getting too far out and that now that the Cold War had ended, there was no real need for the Democratic Party to be providing any kind of alternative to socialism by having these kind of mediocre programs that are only moderately sufficient to be addressing some of the economic injustices in the country. So that we have not only global climate change as the lead story, the impeachment as the second leading story, but this confrontation that's going on inside the Democratic Party between the new, more moderate elements of the Democratic Party and the liberal and progressive elements inside the Democratic Party. And this is manifesting in the debate over the impeachment, as you know. That the progressives, members of the Progressive Caucus that are now 98 members of the House of Representatives out of 435, are leaning forward, demanding the immediate impeachment of Trump on the grounds that what he has done is so completely unacceptable that they cannot possibly leave him in office without his being impeached at least, to stop a precedent being established that if any president comes in and chooses to do what he's doing, that everybody will just advocate waiting until the next election to see if you can get him unelected. So those top three major stories that are going on now are now being challenged by the trade war with China, also the potential threat to invade Iran, the suggesting that they're potentially going to be sending over 120,000 United States military personnel into the Middle East to confront Iran. And of course, we have the growing news of the Keystone XL pipeline that the Trump administration is attempting to build all the way from Canada, the tar sands in Canada, all the way down through the central United States to the Gulf Coast, where it will be refined and sold internationally to everybody except China, defying all of the efforts on the part of 193 countries at the Paris agreements in December of 2015 to all agree to roll back the burning of fossil fuels. So these are the headlines that we've been addressing in this course. As it turns out, it's not coincidental that they coincide with the headlines the major headline issues, because we want our course to be pertinent to you as a generation. Now, we have in the first part of it, from April 1st all the way through to April 29th, we were addressing the issue of global climate change. We've done a deep dive on global climate change, and the students have become expert at the issue of global climate change. John Conway, the PhD graduate in environmental science from the University of California at Santa Barbara, has presented a great deal of information and details to our class about that, so as to get ourselves squared away at the very beginning to understand thoroughly the science behind this issue of global climate change. So that the fact that the oil corporations hire the same public relations firms that were hired by the tobacco industry to try to disprove the fact that the smoking cigarettes was causing cancer, that despite the fact that there's a tiny number of these so-called scientists who say that global climate change is not real, and there's no nexus between the burning of fossil fuels and the onset of global climate change, is more than just a controversial issue. This is pretty much a completely established issue now, and we spent the first month of the course dealing with that. The second portion of the course, from basically May 2nd all the way through to the 21st of May, we've directed our attention to the issue of the impeachment. Our students now are walking experts on the issue of the impeachment. They can recite to you almost verbatim the entirety of Volume 1 and Volume 2. They sleep with it under their pillow. We've had lots of discussions about it. They're also knowledgeable about the debate going on inside the Democratic Party about whether to actually impeach him. And we've had long discussions about some of the subtleties that are involved, which has to do with the fact that both the Republican and Democratic Party leadership are conning everybody into believing that there's no really strong evidence about collusion, and that therefore we should all shift our attention to just the obstruction of justice. And there are these 10 key things that have been identified by Mueller as obstructive acts, and the House of Representatives is digging in just on those. And to make the transition into getting you up to date on where we are in the course, we've pointed out that this myopic focus just on the obstruction of justice is going to be one of the two major challenges in any potential success in getting Donald Trump not only impeached by the House of Representatives, but convicted by the Senate. The first challenge, of course, is that the Senate would, all dominated by Republicans now, would not convict Donald Trump if he shot someone down on Fifth Avenue. And it turns out Trump knows that. And the second major problem, however, is that in order to focus on just the obstruction elements in Volume 2, is going to meet the constant argument that, well, how can you have obstruction of justice if the investigation itself wasn't justified? As long as there's no collusion, there couldn't have been any obstruction because there wasn't any crime to really try to obstruct. And so therefore, any rational argument as to why Trump was obstructing or doing what he was doing was as a result of frustration, the fact that he thought it was a hoax, a whole bunch of different defenses other than the corrupt motive of attempting to obstruct justice. And so that we had suggested in transitioning out of Part 2 of the course that there are other issues to look at with regard to the collusion. And even though Mueller went to the length of pointing out that there's no such thing as collusion, you have to be looking for a conspiracy. And conspiracy has certain elements in it, and he's unable to find a particular agreement that would explain why it is that Trump was acting the way he has been acting toward Putin. And so that it might just be a policy issue, that Trump wants to establish better relations with Russia, and for that reason, it wouldn't be a corrupt motive. And so we discovered that it isn't likely that there's a handful of different motives that have been tossed up to be evaluated. One of them is the famous videos that you've heard talked about Trump, hiring prostitutes in Moscow and all that sordid stuff. and also that they allegedly have videos of him over in St. Petersburg with prostitutes, and that therefore Russia is blackmailing the president. The problem with that is that's too much like the failed attempt to convict Bill Clinton. So he, prior to being president, has engaged in sexual indiscretions, no matter how lurid they might be, doesn't really support an impeachment. The second objectives that they have in trying to suggest that there might be an improper relationship placing the president in a vulnerable position to Russia is the argument that he was money laundering money for the oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs, that they were depositing their ill-gotten gains in the Deutsche Bank in Cyprus, and that bank was then turning around and giving loans to Trump to build his Trump Towers when no one else in the world would give him any loans, and that therefore Trump has become beholden to them. The problem with that is that to the extent to which the Deutsche Bank has successfully laundered those funds, the deposits on the part of the Russian oligarchs, their lending money to Trump may well have successfully laundered those monies, and that the banks don't want to be put in a situation of saying that there has to be a close examination of the source of deposits that come into their banks in order to support their lending the money out. So they want the banks to be designated as a complete wash, primarily because so many of the major banks have so much of their money from drug money coming in from around the world, and that they all know that, and they don't want that looked at, and so the likelihood is very low that the Republican and Democratic Party leadership, with the support of the financial industry, is going to look at that. But what we've discovered, and I'm just closing this kind of introduction for you to get you up to where we are. What we discovered, however, is there's a very peculiar thing that really isn't being looked at much. And that is, it was a portion of the Steele dossier in which Steele asserted that this fellow Carter Page, who was the first person that was subjected to a FISA warrant, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that had the surveillance put on him, that Trump is trying to characterize as spying on my campaign, and that the Republicans in the Senate have now asked Attorney General Barr to investigate the lack of bona fides of any legitimate motive to place Carter Page under surveillance. What we've discovered is that the Steele dossier asserts that Carter Page brokered a major deal that was having to do with the sale of 20% of the previously government-owned Russian oil company, Rosneft, and that there's direct evidence that this guy, Carter Page, went to Russia and met directly with high-level officials of Rosneft and helped negotiate a potential sale of 20% of the Russian oil company to Trump and his associates, secretly. And there's a party to this sale that's called the Intertrust Group that is completely concealed, the members of it. And it has an address down in the Grand Cayman Islands, which are notorious for hiding illegal monies. And that the address of this Intertrust Group is the exact same address in a small building with a fellow named Steven Schwartzman, who is a major economic advisor to Donald Trump. And it turns out that the law firm that actually negotiated the transaction of the sale of this 20% of this major national company was in fact the law firm of Rudolph Giuliani. And so there's all kinds of evidence floating around here that and it says in the dossier that Carter Page met with Igor Sechin, who is the CEO of the Russian National Oil Company, met with him personally, and they struck a deal that 20% of that company would be sold to Trump and his associates in exchange for Trump, if he's elected president, lifting the restrictions against Russia that had been imposed by the Obama administration for Russia entering into the eastern portions of the Crimea in the Ukraine, and the sanctions imposed upon Russia for their purported meddling in the 2016 election. And so the Steele dossier specifically says, and a little attended to sentence, that Carter Page actually met with the CEO of Rosneft and negotiated a deal that if Trump were to be elected president, that he would lift the sanctions, therefore enabling Rosneft to develop the Arctic shelf of northern Russia, which has 87 billion barrels of petroleum under it, and some 30% of all the natural gas on the planet. But the challenge is that in order for that oil and natural gas to be made available, the restrictions on the export of oil from Russia have to be lifted. And moreover, global climate change would have to continue in order to melt off the major ice that's above those ice shelves to make it economically feasible. And thirdly, there would have to be a pipeline. There would have to be a pipeline built from far in the north of Russia all the way down past the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, picking up the oil from under the Black Sea and the natural gas from under the Caspian Sea, and brought all the way down to the Gulf of Arabia, from 45 degrees north latitude down to about 25 degrees north latitude, virtually identical to the length and area of the pipelines from Canada to our Gulf of Mexico. And that pipeline would have had to have gone through Afghanistan. And it turns out that the tribal people of Afghanistan refused to allow the pipeline to be built through their territory. Just like the traditional Lakota people are refusing to allow the pipeline to be built from Canada down through to the Gulf of Mexico. And it turns out that this replicates the conduct of the Aboriginal people in Africa, in Nigeria, in opposing the pipelines and the drilling of oil in Nigeria by Royal Dutch Shell. And it also is virtually identical to the tribal people in Ecuador, resisting the drilling of oil and the contamination of all of their water there. And so what we've done is we've pointed out in part 2 of this course that there is in fact an area that bears important investigation, because what they discovered is that Donald Trump, in preparing to deliver his first major foreign policy address on April 27th of 2016, before the November elections of 2016, he was scheduled to deliver his first major foreign policy speech at the National Press Club, but at the last minute, actually on the 25th, the locale was changed of that, the venue, over to the Mayflower Hotel. And the Mayflower Hotel was leased by the Center for the National Interests, this major organization, a principal board member of which is the partner of the man who owns the building down in the Grand Caymans, where the company was that was involved in purchasing this 20% share of the Russian oil company. And it turns out that immediately prior to that speech on April 27th, there was an exclusive invitation-only VIP cocktail reception in which 24 people were there, virtually every one of whom was directly involved in the sale and purchase of that Russian oil company. Okay? So, and McFarland, Robert McFarland, who is one of the people that was among those 24, published an article in the National Interest, the magazine of the Center for National Interest that sponsored that speech. He published that in June. This was April 27th, so it's just basically 1 month later, in the beginning of June. He published an article in which he said that Russia was going to become the major principal partner of the United States in protecting the energy security for Western civilization. And so that starts to tell you, now if Russia has been suddenly changed from being the East in the East-West conflict to being part of Western civilization, then who is Eastern civilization? It is China. That's the deal here. That the reason that George H.W. Bush invaded the Middle Eastern oil fields under the ruse that Saddam Hussein originally was going to be invading Kuwait and then invading Saudi Arabia. And so he got Saudi Arabia to invite him to come in to basically drive Saddam Hussein back up into Iraq. And the reason that W. Bush then later lied about it and said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and he sent in the rest of the troops to go in and occupy the Middle Eastern oil fields was to deprive China of access to the oil fields and to the oil, because China does not have major oil reserves. And that's what's really going on here. And I would recommend for anyone who wants to look deeper into this is that you take a look at this book, which is called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. This is by Samuel P. Huntington. Samuel P. Huntington was, at the time of writing this book in 1993, right at the end of the Cold War, he was the president of the American Political Science Association, of all the major political scientists in the United States. He was also the Olin Professor of International Relations at Harvard University and was, in fact, the editor of Foreign Policy magazine. So this is no slouch that's making this argument. And he's the one that's arguing on behalf of the United States and Western civilization getting away from all of this increasing multiculturalism, as they refer to it. That if we're going to successfully confront China in the rising of the new Asian empire, the Caucasian race has to get past all of this integration that is going on with other races, in that this entire process has got to stop of multiculturalism, that we've got to regress back to being a white Christian community, ideally Catholic, and ideally reaching out from the Roman Catholic Church to the Russian Orthodox Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church and bringing them back together again, because the essential driving engine of a civilization is their religion. And that therefore he's arguing that they have to return to a white Christian society. Now, so which give you some idea of the echoes of Steve Bannon. That Steve Bannon, as you know, who is Donald Trump's principal strategic political thinker, has advocated the exact same thing. He, in a speech that we have gotten a copy of, because I was given a copy of it by the head of the Vatican archives, who had a copy of it, was a Skyped-in presentation that Steve Bannon made to a bunch of hardcore right-wing reactionary Catholic leaders in a thing called the Institute for Human Dignity, made up of people from Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta, in which he explicitly and at some length advocated that they had to be aware of the fact that there was a bloody Third World War that had to be launched by them against the indigenous people of the world, who were anti-capitalist, anti-Christian, religiously driven, jihadist terrorists who were going to be attacking and stopping the production of the Western industrial powers. And so that, and he advocated when he, during that brief period between January 21st and April 5th of 2017, when he was a member of the National Security Council, actually explicitly recommended that the Dakota people the Lakota people up in the Dakotas who are opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Exile Pipeline, that they be considered to be anti-capitalist, anti-Christian, religiously driven, domestic jihadist terrorists. Okay, so there you've got it right there. There's the connect that's going on here. And for that reason, we are now moving into the third phase of our course here, discussing the role of the indigenous people and being able to participate in stopping global climate change. Because what's going on here in this alliance between Putin and Trump in their financial backers is the attempt to triple the amount of petroleum and natural gas that is going to be developed and sold and burnt into the atmosphere directly in the face of the Paris agreements on the part of 193 nations other than Russia and the U.S. now to stop global climate change. And so attributing to these people, these elements of a nefarious, corrupt motive to be knowingly and willfully destroying the climactic system of the planet is completely true, as it turns out. And that therefore they have to be stopped. And so the question is what percentage of your generation and mine who are not indigenous people are going to work with the indigenous people to stop the drilling of oil and petroleum in their areas and the building of these pipelines to be shipping the oil and natural gas from about 45 degrees north latitude all the way down through the aboriginal territories of these indigenous people down to the warm water ports to have it sold in the world to be burnt. And so that's what we're entering into now, is the third portion of our course in examining the potential role of the indigenous people. And so what I want to do is I want to, there are a number of centers where these conflicts are going on, and that we're going to be talking about these over the period of now, between now and basically June 6th. And these are, of course, the Middle East, what the history is of this conflict going on between the indigenous people, the tribal people of the Middle East, and this element that wants to exploit their oil. Also, North America, the major confrontations going on in North America on the part of the Lakota people in the Dakotas and some of the other indigenous groups, all the way out to the West Coast, in the people from Canada as well, against the Trans-Canada Pipeline. So that's not only the Middle East, but North America. Also, Central and South America. We're going to be focusing on Ecuador and the indigenous people rising up against the pipelines and the drilling in their aboriginal lands down there, in the effort on the part of the Pachamama movement to try to ally white people with the indigenous people to try to stop that type of exploitation. And of course, we're going to be focusing on Africa as well, which has to do primarily with Nigeria and the Royal Dutch Shell and what they're doing, mounting major activities against the indigenous people. So what's going on? When I was the director of the strategic initiative for the new paradigm at the State of the World Forum at the end of the Cold War that we convened up in San Francisco to invite all the former presidents, vice presidents, and secretaries of state, et cetera, to come in to try to discuss how we might take advantage collectively of the end of the Cold War to be able to establish some sort of a new relationship among the people of the world that could help save us from global climate change, among other things. And at that point, I met Dr. Zhenzhou Jing, who is the head of the Chinese Academy of Social Science and Technology Division. Little known to most Americans, there's a huge center in Beijing of 300 professors from all around China that are there to service the Politburo, of the Chinese Communist Party. And they have a whole science and technology division that Dr. Zhen Zhoujing heads up. And what they've been doing is they have been looking for an alternative source of energy, an alternative to petroleum and natural gas and coal. And we had a long set of meetings with them. They have set aside an entire 52nd Economic Development Zone, which is they brought me out to see it. It's actually a gigantic city. It's got office buildings and suburbs with homes, and it's got factories and highways and in the whole 9 yards. And there's not a single soul in it. And they've got it built to prepare for developing an alternative source of energy, generating electricity. And what they're going to be doing is they're going to be building like 30 million electric vehicles to make available to the people in the world, sort of like the Volkswagen Bug back when Germany did that. And what they're going to try to do is to make these electric vehicles available at an extraordinarily government-subsidized low price in order to defeat the effort on the part of the Western powers, including potentially Russia, to monopolize the control of petroleum. And so that China knows what's going on here. If we can figure this out in our class, China can figure it out with 300 professors sitting there working on these things every day. And so that what we're going to be focusing on now is the potential counteroffensive that needs to be undertaken against this effort on the part of not just the Trump administration and not just the Republican Party, but you're going to see also the new, more moderate Democratic Party, led by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden as their hand-picked candidate. They're all going to continue to just slow walk this whole issue about global climate change. And they're going to be trying to have as slow as possible a diminution of the use of petroleum because the people who fund their campaigns and both of the major political party structures are oil corporations and insurance companies and a whole series of others. But the major petroleum corporations and the coal industry, and McConnell, of course, McConnell's from Kentucky, and he wears T-shirts around championing coal, still, and still insisting that global climate change is a hoax on the part of who? China. That's their whole narrative, is that the global climate change is the biggest hoax in history created by China to attempt to undermine our industrial base in North America and the West. And so that the people, at least the people who are not being conned by this, are the indigenous people. The indigenous people know what the relationship is between our human conduct and the impacts on nature. They know what their relationship is to the natural order of things. And so that they immediately red flag any effort on the part of these major oil corporations to come into their territory and poison their territory with their drilling and with their excretion of all of the chemicals and things that are involved in coal mining and the digging of the oil and the natural gas and the fracking that's going on to get the natural gas out of there. And so that what we want to do is we want to focus now on the study of these areas. Now, so I'm going to focus first on the issue of the Middle Eastern oil fields, and we've touched upon this. That what we do, I do in this course is I repeat a number of different times, coming at it from different directions, some of the same information, so that it will stick with us to know what we're doing here. And so I'm going to review some of that here today. And then we'll be moving on to the issue of the Dakota Access Pipeline Challenge. I personally legally represented Chase Iron Eyes, who was the 2016 Democratic Party nominee for the Congress, the single seat in Congress in North Dakota. And he was designated by the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation that was brought in by the Energy Transfer Partners. He was designated as the ringleader of the basic insurrection against the state of North Dakota and the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I was personally defending him, and am intimately familiar with all of the issues that are involved with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And we are now working intimately with the people at the Pine Ridge Reservation, Julian Bearrunner, who is the elected tribal chairman, a 32-year-old young fellow who's the new tribal chairman of the Pine Ridge Reservation, along with Harold Frazier, who is the elected chairperson of the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. These are two of the major reservations that are going to be most adversely impacted by the Keystone XL pipeline. So we're going to be talking about this primarily because I'm engaged in one at the same time, not only instructing you about what it is that's going on, but attempting to recruit you and doing something about it. More than you had planned. So that our whole effort here is to guide you into directions to use your education to participate in stopping this massive global climate change that's underway. And some of it, however, is going to require that in addition to applying your explicitly learned skills at the college and graduate school level, there's going to be an additional responsibility that you have. It spins off the old story of the doctor who's sitting in her office, and a person comes into her office with a broken leg, and so she sets the broken leg and puts a little cast on, and the person leaves, and an hour later another person comes into her office with a broken leg, and she sets their leg and puts it in a cast, etc. And a third person comes in an hour later, and she can't figure out what's going on, so she goes outside and she opens her office door, and there's a gigantic hole in the sidewalk that people are falling into and breaking their leg. And so she decides that even though she's a doctor with all of her years of medical expertise and all that kind of stuff, she better spend some time filling in the hole. Okay? And so that's what we're talking about now. Even though you're studying to be, engineers, sustainable engineers, absolutely extraordinarily important work, and others are planning to be lawyers and doctors and other things that your generation is going to have to spend a portion of your time allying with the indigenous people of the world to participate in stopping this global climate change. Because Donald Trump, the second thing that he did upon coming into office, he came into office on the 21st of January of 2017, and the first thing he did, as you know, he issued the executive order banning all Muslim people from coming into the United States. And then the second thing that he did on January 24th was issue an executive order ordering the United States United States Army Corps of Engineers to reverse its decision that they had to stop the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline because it was in violation of the provisions of the Environmental Protection Act. Okay, and so he just came in and said, screw the Environmental Protection Act. We have a domestic energy crisis here in the United States. We need to, as the president, override the application of all of these rules, not only the environmental protection rules, but also the Administrative Procedures Act rules that have to do with due process that goes on if you're going to be applying for a permit to build a major pipeline like that, transferring 91,000 gallons an hour of petroleum right through some of the most important environmental areas of the country, okay? And so he just came in and ordered that they go forward and do that. And he said not only it applied to the Dakota Access Pipeline, but also to the Keystone XL pipeline. And he ordered them all to ignore the Environmental Protection Act rules and go forward and do this. And he reversed the decision made by the Obama administration to completely cancel the XL pipeline, the Keystone pipeline. It was to transfer the tar sands from Canada all the way down through the United States to the Gulf of Mexico. So he ordered those things to be reversed, and within a matter of days, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said, pursuant to the order of the president, we have reversed our position on this without any explanation for it, without any kind of rational justification for it, completely ignoring the Environmental Protection Agency's rulings before that had been undertaken pursuant to due process, and ignoring the Department of Justice ruling that this was in clear violation of the Environmental Protection Act. So that was the second thing that he did. And in fact, he then ordered the opening of all Indian reservations in the entire North America to drilling for oil and the mining of coal and fracking for natural gas, and also opened all the national parks for the massive oil drilling and coal mining in natural gas fracking. And he also then opened up all the coastlines, including the Gulf of Mexico that had that massive, horrible spill, and all the coastlines, the eastern and western coastlines, ordered by executive order, ordered them all to be opened for the drilling of oil. Okay, and all under the ruse of there being a domestic energy shortage. And as soon as he got that done, after a matter of a couple more months, he announced that we had now overcome the domestic energy shortage, and our real objective was to become the #1 dominant energy producer on the planet. And when he says we, he means the private corporations that are the ones doing this, and the ones whose shareholders are sharing all of the profits in this, as all the damages are being laid off onto the public. And so that's what's going on here. And so what I want to do first is I want to point out that this process of invading the Middle Eastern oil fields, which to this day, not 0.1% of the people in the United States are actually grokking that that's what happened. You know, they get caught in all of this deception of, oh, well, didn't Saddam Hussein have weapons of mass destruction? Oh, I guess that was proven not to be true. Oops, I guess we got that wrong. But as long as we're there, we might as well keep them, you know? And they are completely blanking the fact that that was the second invasion of the Middle Eastern oil fields. It wasn't the first. The first invasion took place back in 1991 under George H.W. Bush. And what I want to do now is I want to repeat probably for the third time for all my other students who are now learning this by heart. But what happened there, and I want you to be able to go home, and I want you to be able to tell your family about this. I want you to be able to tell your friends about this. I want you to be able to tell all your other classmates in the School of Engineering about this, and over at Rachel Carson College. I want you to tell them about this, because the fact is nobody seems to know it. But what happened is that in June of 1991, now remember, the Soviet Union officially dissolved on December 31st of 1991 when Gorbachev signed the releasing all the different republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics from having to stay part of the USSR. Okay, and so it was 6 months earlier, in June of 1991, that George H.W. Bush, the president at that time, now remember, he was elected in 1988, November of 1988, after serving 2 terms as vice president under Ronald Reagan. It went on from 1980 to 1988. He gets elected in November of 1988, so he's president in 1991 in his first, and thank goodness only, term. What he finds out in June of 1991, he starts getting information from his Central Intelligence Agency that there's indications that Gorbachev is actually planning to dissolve the Soviet Union and to withdraw from the then 75-year Cold War. And what George H.W. Bush says, well, wait a second. If he does that, then we're going to lose our major adversary that we've had for 75 years. We've been using the fact that Russia was purportedly going to be trying to take over the whole world. We've been using that as an excuse for having a $400 million, $500 million, up to $700 billion annual military budget in order to protect all the rest of the world from being taken over by the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union withdraws from this Cold War, we're going to be left high and dry with no excuse for continuing to have a $700 billion a year military budget. And so what he did is he sent a handwritten communication to Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, whom, as it turns out, he knew personally, because when George H.W. Bush was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1975 to 1977 under Gerald Ford, right after Nixon resigned in August of 1974, Gerald Ford appointed George H.W. Bush to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And it was in that capacity that he came to know personally Saddam Hussein, because Saddam Hussein had been financed to come into power in Iraq by the Central Intelligence Agency. And so he knew him personally. So he sends a handwritten note to Saddam Hussein in June of 1991, hand-delivered to Saddam Hussein by April Gillespie, who was the United States ambassador to Iraq. And she delivers the note to him, and it says in the note, it says, I am aware of the fact that you're having difficulty with Kuwait on your southern border, and that you believe that they're slant drilling under your boundary and stealing Iraqi oil from under your territory. And I want to make it clear that I would like to have that dispute resolved peacefully. But if you find that that isn't possible, I want you to know that if you find it necessary to resort to the use of military force to stop them from doing this, I would personally not find that to be adverse to the long-term interests of the United States. Okay? So doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what Saddam Hussein did. Is Saddam Hussein mobilized 10,000 Iraqi military troops and sends them to their southern border, all along the northern border of Kuwait. And then what happens is George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, who was, see how they're all up on this? Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney is the Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush. So Dick Cheney contacts after this has been delivered and they've mobilized their forces down there, Dick Cheney is the Secretary of Defense, contacts Prince Bandar, who is the ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia, and asks him to come to the West Wing of the White House. And he brings him into a meeting where there's at that time Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, his deputy Paul Wolfowitz, his attorney David Addington, Doug Fife, Elliot Abrams, and Scooter Libby are all in this meeting. Okay, and this is in July now of 1991. And he says, Prince Bandar, I would like to inform you personally, face to face, that our United States intelligence community has come to find out that Saddam Hussein is mobilizing military forces on their southern border, the northern border of Kuwait, and they're preparing to invade and occupy Kuwait. And we have equally reliable intelligence that tells us that after Saddam Hussein has gone in and occupied Kuwait, he's going to go into Saudi Arabia, and he's going to try to overthrow the House of Saud. Okay? And he says, by the way, let me show you, in order to show you that this is true, let me show you real-time NSA video from our satellites, showing the 10,000 military troops assembled on the southern border of Iraq. And he shows him real-time footage from NSA satellites, right? And so Prince Bandar goes, oh my gosh, that seems to be really credible, your assertions then. And so what Dick Cheney says to him, we would like to, if in fact it's proven that he's getting ready to invade Kuwait and occupy Kuwait, we don't want you to wait until he's invaded and occupied Saudi Arabia, which, as it turns out, there was no evidence whatsoever. No evidence whatsoever to suggest he was going to do that. But he said that if in fact he invades Kuwait and occupies them, then we would want you not to wait until he tries to invade Saudi Arabia. We'd like to have you invite us, that is me, Dick Cheney, to come over to China, or excuse me, come over to Saudi Arabia and meet with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah. And we would like to invoke the secret treaty which none of you know anything about. And the fact is, even if you were at Harvard, in foreign policy, you wouldn't know anything about it. But the fact is, he said, we would like to invoke a secret treaty that was signed by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger back in August of 1972, when they were on their way back from China in the SR-71 Blackbird, that big stealth vehicle, that they were on their way back from opening China, and they stopped in Saudi Arabia, and Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon met personally with King Faisal, met with King Faisal, and entered into an agreement that Nixon and Kissinger would cause the Western oil corporations, the Seven Sisters, who had the exclusive 60-year lease agreement that had been signed at the end of World War I, to be able to have exclusive lease rights to all the oil in Saudi Arabia in exchange for a 6% royalty being paid to the House of Saud. We would like to we would like to have a new contract renewing that for an additional 60 years, and we will agree to allow you to raise the price of oil that you get from 42 cents on every gallon at the pump up to $1.42. You just have to agree that on that additional $1 a gallon at the pump of the price you're going to be getting now for your oil, that you need to use that $1, a portion of it, to buy military equipment exclusively from United States military corporations, such as the AWACS airborne radar, to the across-the-horizon radar, to F-16s, etc. You need to purchase all of your military equipment from the United States corporations. Secondly, you have to use another portion of that $1 a gallon at the pump that you're going to be getting. You need to use an additional portion of that to dredge out the harbors in your country to be able to take our American warships. And thirdly, you have to use the money to help build major military bases where we can fly in U.S. troops and land them in your country and establish a military presence in your country if either Russia or China make any type of a feint toward invading and occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields. And so that treaty got signed by King Faisal back in August of 1972 with Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. And then they flew to Iran and got the same agreement from the Shah of Iran, Pahlavi, signed the same agreement.